The first sound was silk, a faint whisper against stone, delicate but deliberate, breaking the hush of dawn. Then came the low murmur of eunuch guards outside the chamber door, voices steady and unchanging, like a chant meant to remind those within of who held power over them. The room itself was heavy with perfume. Orange blossoms from the palace gardens mingled with the resinous smoke of expensive incense, so dense it clung to the skin. To outsiders, it was the fragrance of wealth. To the 6-year-old girl lying awake on her thin pallet, it was suffocating. She was Theodora, daughter of a bear-keeper, child of Constantinople, and prisoner of circumstance. The year was around 500 AD. Beyond these walls, Constantinople was alive with chaos and glory, merchants shouting in the markets, senators debating laws in marble halls, the clang of smiths and the hum of prayers from 100 churches. But inside the Hippodrome faction compound, the quarters of the Greens, the world shrank to silk, incense, and the gnawing certainty of loss. Her father, Acacius, was gone. Once a towering figure who smelled of hay and wild animals, who could calm even the angriest bear with a single command, he had been consumed by fever in just 3 days. His absence was louder than the guards' whispers, heavier than the incense. It was a void that threatened to swallow them all. In the next room, her mother wept, a sound that had become constant, muffled but unending. Theodora's sisters, exhausted by grief, slept huddled together, but Theodora remained awake, listening. From the hippodrome below came the distant roar of caged beasts, the rattle of buckets, the preparation for another day of spectacle. The city moved on, indifferent. To it, her father had been nothing more than a servant of entertainment. His death meant nothing. Theodora already understood the cruelty of that indifference. Her family's presence in this place had always been conditional, tied to her father's labor. Now, without him, their position was as fragile as silk threads fraying under strain. To the Greens, they were no longer retainers. They were debts waiting to be cut loose. 3 days later, her mother gathered what dignity she had left. With trembling hands, she dressed her daughters in their finest tunics, once bright with the colors of the Greens, but now threadbare and patched. Each stitch testified to a prosperity that had never truly been theirs. To Theodora, the act felt like a ritual sacrifice. Her mother's face was pale, her lips tight with terror, yet she guided her daughters forward into the marble corridors, her silence louder than prayer. The hall of the Greens was bright with sunlight, the dust in the air glittering like gold. Its leaders lounged on couches, adorned in silks richer than anything Theodora had ever touched. Rings gleamed on their fingers, cups of wine in hand. Their expressions as the little family entered were not welcoming, nor even curious, just faintly irritated, as if swatting away an interruption. Her mother's voice cracked as she pleaded. She spoke of her husband's loyalty, his years of service, his skill with beasts that brought the Greens both glory and profit. She begged not for gifts, but simply for another chance, for work, for survival, for her children not to starve. Her words fell into the air like broken pottery, fragile and ignored. Theodora never forgot the way one man examined his fingernails instead of listening. Another swirled his wine, gazing past her family as if they were invisible. When her mother's voice finally broke, silence followed, until a bored flick of the hand dismissed them. The gesture carried no weight to the man who gave it, but to Theodora it was the sound of a door slamming forever. Guards shoved them back into the sunlight. The men's laughter echoed behind them, cruel and casual. The brilliance of Constantinople's midday sun was blinding. Theodora blinked as the dust of the street clung to her tunic, already staining what little dignity they had tried to preserve. Her mother's tears cut lines down her cheeks, her shoulders bent beneath humiliation. For a long moment, she stood frozen, defeated, until her gaze fixed on another building in the distance. It was the headquarters of the Blues, the rival faction to the Greens. Without a word, she gripped her daughter's hands and marched toward it. The air around the Blues was different, sharper, colder, eyes keener. Unlike the Greens' mocking indulgence, the Blues received them with quiet calculation. They were led not into a grand hall, but into a smaller chamber, where their leader sat at a table piled with ledgers. Rings glittered on his fingers as he regarded them with a stare as cold as winter seas. He did not waste words on pity. His gaze passed over the mother, then the daughters, until it settled on Theodora. She felt the weight of his scrutiny, not warm, not cruel, but appraising, as though she were an object to be valued. The silence was crushing. Finally he nodded. They would be taken in. Food, shelter, protection, these would be granted. But the price was not named. It did not need to be. Her mother gasped with relief, clutching her daughters, thanking him with trembling gratitude. To her, it was salvation. To Theodora, it was a new kind of chain. Even as a child, she sensed it. Her future was no longer hers to shape. The blue faction had claimed her, body and soul. In that moment, while her mother wept with joy, Theodora's young heart hardened. She saw clearly what the adults could not. The bargain was not mercy, but possession. And she, the girl who had just buried her father, now understood that survival in Constantinople would never be about fairness or compassion. It would be about power, who wielded it, and who was forced to bend beneath it. The Blues had given shelter, but shelter was never free. Theodora learned quickly that survival in their world was measured not in coin or bread, but in spectacle. Her new classroom was not a library or a church, but the dusty training yards behind the hippodrome. Here, veterans of the stage, acrobats with scarred knees, dancers whose joints cracked with every movement, comedians whose voices had gone hoarse, trained the next generation of performers. Theodora was among them, a child pressed into the endless grind of practice. She did not learn letters or philosophy, but how to bend her body into impossible arcs, how to balance on a rope, how to twist her voice to carry across the deafening roar of 30,000 spectators. She learned that the crowd was not an audience, it was a god, unpredictable and merciless, whose favor must be won night after night. By 10, the hippodrome had become her world. She inhaled its dust, felt its stones beneath her bare feet, and measured her worth by the rise and fall of its cheers. Her tutors drilled into her that laughter could be more powerful than a sword, and that a well-timed tear was worth more than any purse of coins. She mimicked senators and officials, lampooning their struts and pompous habits, turning the arena into a theater of ridicule. Each caricature was a lesson in power, who held it, who abused it, and how it could be mocked to earn the crowd's roar. Theodora's body grew strong, wiry with muscle, her voice sharpened like steel, her wit quick and biting. By 16, she was no longer a student, but a star. Her performances drew not only the applause of commoners in the upper tiers, but also the leering gazes of men in silk robes at the front. To the people of Constantinople, she was dazzling, her beauty striking, her voice magnetic, her stage presence unmatched. But behind the curtain, the reality was uglier. Each bouquet tossed onto the sand was matched by a hand that reached to claim her body. To the powerful men of the capital, she was not an artist, but a commodity, a temporary diversion dressed in silk. Coins landed at her feet, not as tribute, but as payment. She bowed on stage, then retreated into shadows where her value was tallied by others. The applause that shook the hippodrome was, to her ears, tinged with contempt. Still, Theodora endured. She learned to wear masks, laughter, charm, seduction, not because she believed in them, but because they were survival. If she could not be free, she could at least be feared. If she could not be honored, she could be unforgettable. The Blues had taken her childhood, but they had also honed her into something sharp and dangerous. It was then, at the height of her fame, that another door appeared. His name was Hecebolus, a governor from Pentapolis, the Libyan coast of the Byzantine Empire. Unlike the drunk aristocrats who pawed at her after performances, Hecebolus was serious. A man of rank and office, cloaked in authority rather than velvet idleness. He watched her not with crude hunger, but with a calculating, quiet focus. When he approached her, it was not with coins but with words, an offer of legitimacy. He asked her to leave Constantinople, to sail with him to Africa, not as a mistress to be discarded at whim, but as his acknowledged companion. For Theodora, the promise was intoxicating, to escape the dust of the arena, the sneers of the aristocracy, the endless cycle of performance and degradation. This was a chance at freedom, or at least the closest thing she had ever been offered. The thought electrified her. Here was a man who could lift her from the gutter of spectacle to the dignity of a governor's household. She knew better than to call it love. She had shed those illusions long ago. But it was escape. It was legitimacy. It was the chance to step into a world where she would not be jeered at or pawed over, but perhaps, just perhaps, respected. So when the moment came, Theodora did not hesitate. She turned her back on the hippodrome, on the city that had both raised her up and dragged her down. With the reckless hope of someone who had nothing left to lose, she boarded a ship bound south, the spray of the sea cold on her face, her eyes fixed on a horizon that glittered with possibility. The sea voyage itself was brutal, the ship pitching and groaning as it cut across the wine-dark waters. Yet, Theodora felt something she had not known in years: anticipation. When the Libyan coastline finally appeared, a haze of ochre cliffs and dry wind, it seemed like a new beginning. In Pentapolis, she was treated with a respect she had never experienced. Servants attended her, courtyards opened onto brilliant stars, and for a fleeting season, she allowed herself to believe the past had been left behind. But she had underestimated the transience of men in power. Governors are appointed, and governors are dismissed. When the order came from Constantinople, Hypsipylus packed his household with ruthless efficiency. Theodora was not included. She was left on the docks of Alexandria as though she were an empty wineskin, discarded without ceremony. The man who had promised her escape did not look back. Theodora watched his ship vanish into the horizon, and with it, the illusion of her new life. The applause of the hippodrome was gone. The dignity of companionship was gone. She was alone, surrounded by strangers in a city that did not care if she lived or starved. For the first time, she confronted a truth that would define her forever. Men could offer her protection, but never freedom. To survive, she would have to claim power for herself. The docks of Alexandria swarmed with noise and color. Ships from every corner of the Mediterranean unloaded their cargo: sacks of grain, amphorae of wine, coils of rope. Sailors shouted in a dozen tongues, gulls screamed overhead, and the smell of salt and sweat and fish clung to everything. In this chaos stood Theodora, abandoned, her silks already soiled by the dust of the quay. The ship that had brought her here now carried Hypsipylus away, its sails swelling with the wind, his ambition pulling him back to Constantinople. He had not even spared her a final glance. Theodora was 20, and utterly alone. She had been discarded before, but never so far from home, never with the sea itself stretched between her and the city she knew. She did not have family here, nor allies, nor even the dignity of her stage. All she had were her wits, her body, and the survival instincts forged in the arena. The city of Alexandria was overwhelming, a metropolis of marble colonnades, sun-baked streets, and teeming markets where languages collided like waves. It was a city both Greek and Egyptian, Roman and Christian, filled with scholars in the libraries and beggars in the shadows. To Theodora, it was at first nothing more than a maze of hostility. Hunger taught her its lessons quickly. She learned which bakers might offer a stale crust near closing, which vendors left scraps unguarded, which alleyways provided shelter from the blazing sun. Gone were the silks of the hippodrome. She wrapped herself in simple wool, a cloak to mask both her identity and her shame, her proud posture bent into one of invisibility. She, who had once commanded the roar of 30,000, now walked like a ghost. And yet, survival sharpened her senses. The same skills that had once drawn audiences, the ability to read the mood of a crowd, to shift her voice, to mirror gestures, now became tools for staying alive. She could tell when a merchant was suspicious, when a guard might look the other way, when a passerby might offer alms. Even in desperation, she remained a performer. It was in this state of near collapse that she stumbled into a small chapel, tucked away in a quiet street. Its wooden door was unadorned, its walls plain. It did not look like the grand basilicas of Constantinople, heavy with mosaics and marble. Inside, it was dark, cool, and spare. A group of worshippers murmured their prayers, their voices soft but fervent. The air was thick not with incense of emperors, but with the faint scent of bread and cheap wine. These were the Monophysites, a sect of Christians who believed in the single divine nature of Christ, in defiance of the imperial orthodoxy. They were a community of outcasts, persecuted, watched, but unbroken. They offered bread and wine to the poor who entered. Theodora, hollow with hunger, accepted with trembling hands. She bowed her head, not in prayer, but in shame. Yet something in the words spoken by the preacher pierced her. This Christ was not the distant judge of emperors, but the Christ of the persecuted, the despised, the abandoned. This was a faith of the outcast, a theology that spoke of suffering as a bond, not a curse. It was a message that resonated with Theodora, like nothing had before. Her conversion was not the gentle blooming of faith, but a calculated transformation. She recognized power where she found it, and here, in the words of these persecuted Christians, she found a weapon sharper than the applause of the hippodrome. She attached herself to them, no longer as a performer, but as a servant, a messenger, a scribe, a quiet pair of eyes and ears. Her hunger for survival transformed into a hunger for knowledge. She absorbed the intricacies of doctrine, the subtleties of debate, the way bishops and patriarchs wielded theology as a weapon as sharp as any sword. She listened to whispered strategies in the chapel's back rooms, learning who was loyal to Constantinople, who resisted, who plotted. Where others heard sermons, Theodora heard maps of power. It was here that the fragments of her past life reassembled into something new. The mimicry she had practiced in the hippodrome became a tool for studying priests and senators alike. The command of voice that once roused crowds now served to persuade in private conversations. The watchfulness she had cultivated to survive the streets of Alexandria turned her into a strategist, cataloging grievances, ambitions, and weaknesses. In this crucible of betrayal, hunger, and faith, Theodora was remade. The abandoned actress became something harder, a woman who understood that both men and gods could be manipulated if one knew the right language. When at last she secured passage on a merchant ship back across the Mediterranean, she was no longer the girl who had left Constantinople with a governor's promise. The sea spray that struck her face as the vessel crossed the waves felt like a baptism, washing away the last traces of shame. By 522 AD, Theodora returned to her home city, not as a discarded actress, but as a woman armed with knowledge, patience, and a burning will to claim power. She had been thrown to the streets, and in that crucible, she had discovered something the factions, the arena, and even Hecebolus had failed to give her. The understanding that she needed no man's protection. She would carve her own path, no matter how impossible it seemed. The ship that carried her back across the wine-dark sea was no governor's vessel, no gilded promise. It was a groaning merchant cog, heavy with grain and oil, and one solitary woman who had been burned down to iron by exile. When Constantinople's golden domes rose again on the horizon, Theodora did not see homecoming. She saw opportunity, but she was careful. Boldness could destroy as easily as it could elevate. She did not return to the noisy faction houses or the gaudy theaters that remembered her as a performer. Instead, she chose a modest dwelling tucked into a warren of streets climbing the hill toward the imperial palace. The room was bare, whitewashed, with a small window that gave her a sliver of the skyline, the domes of Hagia Sophia, the flutter of imperial standards. From here, she could watch power without being seen by it, and she cultivated an image, the humble spinner. Each morning, she sat at her window with wool and spindle, her hands learning the rhythm of labor, her body bowed in postures of industry. To passers-by, servants, priests, curious neighbors, she was a reformed woman, a penitent who had turned her back on sin. They saw chastity, humility, repentance. But beneath the disguise, her eyes missed nothing. She tracked the comings and goings of senators, memorized the routes of palace guards, noted which clerics carried influence, and which nobles grew fat on bribes. The spinning wheel hummed like a clock, marking her patience. She was not hiding. She was weaving her place in the web of empire. It was months later, as she spun in silence, that her calculated stillness was rewarded. The sound of boots on cobblestones, the disciplined cadence of soldiers, announced the passing of an imperial procession. At its center was a man whose reputation had already begun to shape the city. Justinian, nephew to the Emperor Justin. He was known for his severity, his obsession with law, his relentless drive for order. He was a man whose mind, sharper than any sword, carved Rome's future one statute at a time. Theodora did not rush to the window. She remained seated, hands still on the wool, back straight. Only when the shadow of his retinue crossed her threshold did she lift her gaze. It was not the submissive glance of a penitent, nor the coquettish flutter of an actress. It was direct, unflinching. Her eyes met his with calm assessment. He stopped. His entourage faltered into an awkward silence. He was a man accustomed to flattery or fear, but not to being seen, truly seen, by a woman who neither trembled nor begged. The air thickened. Then she spoke. Her voice, trained in the hippodrome to pierce the roar of 30,000, was low now, but precise. She referenced a recent law debated in the Senate, a matter of property rights. She offered a counter-argument, not rehearsed from scrolls, but grounded in the lives of those who lived under its weight. She pointed out loopholes, unintended consequences, injustices hidden behind fine phrasing. It was an argument not of a supplicant, but of an equal. Justinian, who had mastered debate against the empire's finest jurists, stood in stunned silence. Slowly, fascination replaced surprise. In this woman, humbly seated with wool in her lap, he saw not a penitent but a strategist, someone who wielded intellect like a blade. From that moment, obsession took root. For Theodora, it was not seduction in the traditional sense, no fluttering of lashes, no coy smiles. She had no need for such tools. What captivated Justinian was her mind, her courage, the clarity with which she dissected law, as though she were cutting open the very anatomy of empire. Yet a wall stood between them, an ancient Roman statute dating back to Augustus, forbidding any man of senatorial rank from marrying an actress or prostitute. It was not merely law, it was prejudice fossilized into the bones of the empire, a safeguard to keep bloodlines pure and social order intact. To many in Constantinople, Theodora was still a circus girl, tainted by her past. But Justinian's will was relentless. He marshaled scribes, jurists, and advisors. Scrolls of ancient law were unfurled, combed for contradictions. His arguments were cold, brilliant demolitions. The statute was archaic, an anomaly, an impediment to imperial stability. He reframed the matter not as personal desire, but as necessary reform, a modernization of Rome itself. He argued that an emperor's right to regulate society outweighed outdated moral prejudices. Within the incense-laden chambers of the palace, Justinian pressed his case to the aging Emperor Justin. He spoke of stability, of piety, of a woman whose transformation from sinner to penitent symbolized redemption for the empire itself. He spoke of Theodora's intellect, her virtue, her potential as more than a consort, perhaps as a partner in governance. The old emperor, frail and weary, trusted his nephew's judgment. With a wavering hand guided by Justinian's iron will, he signed the decree. It was not merely a pardon, it was an obliteration of the old law. In 525 AD, the law of Theodora was proclaimed. Actresses could marry into senatorial rank. In truth, it was less a reform than a weapon aimed at prejudice itself. And its name, her name, echoed through forums and basilicas with scandalous intimacy. For Theodora, the moment was electric. It was the first time she felt the raw force of law bend in her favor, reshaping the empire not for a class or a cause, but for her alone. It was more than marriage. It was legitimacy. It was power. The rope she had spun in silence was now taut, pulling her toward the throne. The great church of the Holy Apostles was suffocating with incense, beeswax, and the press of humanity. Sunlight filtered through jeweled mosaics, scattering fractured beams across the assembly of Constantinople's most powerful. Senators in gleaming togas stood stiff as statues, their eyes betraying the contempt their lips dared not speak. To them, the coronation was an obscenity. The bear-keeper's daughter, the hippodrome actress, now ascending beside Justinian to claim a diadem reserved for Rome's noblest blood. Theodora felt their stares like daggers. Yet, when the patriarch lowered the pearl-encrusted crown onto her brow, she did not flinch. Years of the stage had trained her face into a mask of serene composure. Beneath it, her heart thundered with triumph. Let them glare. Let them whisper. Their hatred only hardened her resolve. She had clawed her way from the gutter to the summit of empire, and she would not look down. But crowns are not made of gold alone. They are forged in fire. That fire came in January 532 AD. What began as discontent over a bungled execution ignited into an inferno that consumed the city. The Nika riots were unlike anything Constantinople had seen. The blues and greens, ancient rivals whose feuds had shaped Theodora's childhood. United at last, not in games, but in rage. The mobs filled the streets, torches raised, their chants hammering against the palace walls. Nika, conquer! They were not cheering chariots. They were demanding an emperor's fall. Theodora watched from the palace windows as the city burned. Marble forums were swallowed by smoke, shops looted, churches desecrated. The roar of the crowd was not the fickle applause of the hippodrome. It was the sound of annihilation. Within the palace, panic spread like plague. Senators and generals urged Justinian to flee, to abandon the capital and seek refuge overseas. Their words tumbled over one another, a chorus of cowardice. For a moment, even Justinian wavered. His eyes flicked toward the hidden passage leading to the sea. He saw survival. Theodora saw ruin. She rose, her body coiled with the unshakable authority of the stage. Her voice, clear as steel, cut through the panic. She spoke not of flight, but of legacy. She reminded them of the purple robes they wore, not as garments, but as shrouds. The purple makes a fine, winding sheet, she declared. To flee would mean living as beggars in foreign courts, ghosts of the empire they once ruled. To stand and die in purple, however, would mean eternity. The room fell silent. Her certainty was contagious. Justinian straightened. The emperor, who had hesitated moments before, now commanded with renewed ferocity. Orders rang through the palace. The generals Belisarius and Mundus moved their troops with precision. While the mob gathered in the hippodrome, drunk on its own fury, imperial forces sealed the exits. What followed was not a battle, but a slaughter. The hippodrome, once Theodora's stage, became a killing ground. Swords rose and fell, shields smashed through bodies, and the cries of 30,000 voices turned from defiance to terror. By dawn, the sand was red with blood. The rebellion was finished. The throne, shaken to its core, stood firm once more. And its survival was owed not to Justinian's advisors, but to Theodora's unyielding resolve. From that day on, none doubted her steel. As Empress, she ruled not in shadows, but in partnership. For 2 decades, Theodora was not merely consort, but co-regent. Where Justinian reformed the law and strengthened the empire's bureaucracy, Theodora turned her power toward mercy, mercy sharpened by memory. She pushed through edicts protecting women from forced prostitution, granting mothers rights over their children, and founding sanctuaries where the destitute could find refuge. Each law was a quiet act of vengeance against the cruelties she had endured. Each decree was a monument built on the grave of the girl who had once begged outside faction halls. But her legacy was not only ink on parchment. After the riots reduced the great church of Hagia Sophia to ash, Theodora urged Justinian to rebuild, not merely restore, but surpass. What rose was no ordinary basilica, but a marvel of the world, its golden dome appearing to float, suspended by heaven itself. It was more than a church. It was a declaration. Rome might bleed, but it would never bow. For centuries to come, the silhouette of that dome would bear her imprint against the sky. Yet, even the strongest will cannot conquer the body. In her 40s, Theodora fell ill. Whispers spoke of cancer, a creeping, relentless enemy that gnawed at her from within. The pain was savage, but she endured it as she had endured everything, with defiance. She had survived hunger, humiliation, exile, and the hatred of the nobility. She would not let suffering strip her dignity now. In 548 AD, Theodora died in the imperial palace, wrapped in the purple she had once named her shroud. She was buried in the Church of the Holy Apostles, her memory bound forever to the city she had ruled. Her life was a paradox and a legend. The barefoot child of a bearkeeper who became Empress of the Roman world, the actress the Senate despised who bent law itself to her will, the woman whom men sought to discard, who instead carved her name into eternity. Perhaps the most terrifying truth for her enemies was not that Theodora survived their contempt, but that she turned it into power. For centuries, she has remained a symbol, not of submission, but of resilience, intelligence, and audacity. The woman who began life in chains ended it in a crown, and even now, her story burns as proof that the powerless can rise, and that empires can be remade by the hands of those they sought to destroy.